Chris had always dreamed of owning a house in a quiet, suburban neighborhood. After years of scrimping and saving, he finally found the perfect home, an elegant single-story house with a wide front yard and a wraparound porch. Nestled in a peaceful cul-de-sac, it was the ideal place for him to settle down and enjoy the fruits of his labor. The previous owner, an elderly man named Mr. Jenkins, had lived there for decades but decided to sell the property and retire to a warmer climate. The transaction went smoothly, and Chris was eager to move in and start this new chapter of his life. The morning of the move was bright and sunny, and Chris arrived at his new home with a sense of excitement. The moving truck pulled into the driveway, and a couple of movers began unloading his furniture and boxes. Chris couldn't wait to see how his belongings would look in the new space. As he stood on the porch directing the movers, he noticed a woman approaching from across the street. She was in her mid-50s, impeccably dressed in pastel-colored athleisure wear, carrying a clipboard. Her hair was perfectly styled, and her oversized sunglasses perched atop her head as if she were attending some kind of suburban fashion show. Her confident stride and air of self-importance made Chris think she might be someone from the neighborhood association, perhaps coming to introduce herself. "Good morning." Chris greeted her with a smile, eager to make a good impression on his new neighbors. The woman didn't return the pleasantries. Instead, she looked him up and down, her lips pursed in disapproval. "You must be the new tenant," she said in a clipped tone, as if the very idea annoyed her. Chris frowned slightly but kept his tone friendly. "Actually, I'm the new owner. My name's Chris. It's nice to meet you." She raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Karen," she said curtly, "I'm the head of the homeowner association for this neighborhood. I'm here to let you know that there are rules you'll need to follow." Chris blinked, slightly taken aback by her abruptness. "Oh, okay," he said, trying to process her tone. "I wasn't aware there was a homeowner association involved. I'll be sure to look into it." Karen sighed dramatically, as if his ignorance was a personal affront to her. "Well, you should have been told before you moved in. This neighborhood has standards, and we expect everyone to adhere to them. For starters, that truck can't block the street like that." Chris turned to look at the moving truck, which was indeed partially parked on the street. The movers, however, were unloading quickly and efficiently, and it was clear the truck wouldn't be there long. "They're almost done unloading," Chris explained. "It shouldn't be a problem for much longer." Karen's expression didn't soften. "That's not the point," she snapped. "We have rules for a reason. And another thing, you're not allowed to paint your house without submitting a request to the homeowner association for approval. It's part of the neighborhood guidelines." Chris was puzzled. He hadn't even mentioned painting the house, and the idea hadn't crossed his mind yet. "I'm not planning on painting the house anytime soon," he said carefully, not wanting to escalate the situation. "But thanks for letting me know." Karen wasn't finished. She pointed to a small collection of decorative lawn ornaments near the porch, plastic flamingos and gnomes left by the previous owner. "Those stay," she declared. "They're part of the aesthetic, and removing them would be against the community standards." Chris looked at the faded and slightly tacky ornaments, wondering if she was serious. "I'll have to take a look at the homeowner association guidelines," he said diplomatically. "I wasn't aware of these restrictions." Karen's tone turned even more condescending. "It's your responsibility to know the rules. If you don't follow them, there will be consequences. I suggest you educate yourself quickly." Chris nodded, still trying to maintain his composure. "I'll look into it," he said. "Thanks for the heads up." Karen didn't respond, instead jotting something down on her clipboard and muttering something about newcomers ruining the neighborhood. She gave him one last disdainful glance before turning on her heel and striding back across the street. Chris stood there for a moment, stunned. This wasn't exactly the warm welcome he'd been expecting. The movers, who had overheard the exchange, exchanged knowing glances. "She seems pleasant," one of them quipped. Chris chuckled despite himself. "Yeah, real charming." The rest of the day passed without incident, but Karen's words lingered in Chris's mind. That evening, after the movers had left and Chris had settled into his new home, he decided to investigate further. He pulled out the paperwork from his purchase and carefully reviewed the details. To his surprise, he found a clause that specifically stated his property was not part of the homeowner association. The previous owner had opted out years ago when the association was first established, and the exemption had been grandfathered in. This meant that Karen and the homeowner association had no authority over his property. Relieved but still wary, Chris decided to tread carefully. He didn't want to start off on the wrong foot with his neighbors, but he also wasn't about to let Karen bully him. He resolved to be polite but firm if the issue came up again. Little did he know, this was only the beginning of his encounters with Karen and her overbearing attitude. That night, as Chris sat on his porch, enjoying the cool evening air, he noticed Karen watching him from her house across the street. Her blinds were partially drawn, but her silhouette was unmistakable. Chris smiled to himself and waved, knowing full well she probably wouldn't wave back. Sure enough, she disappeared behind the blinds without a response. Chris chuckled and shook his head. "Welcome to the neighborhood," he muttered to himself. Chris woke up early the next morning, eager to continue settling into his new home. The sunlight streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow on the walls of his bedroom. Today he planned to work on the yard, clearing out the clutter left by the previous owner. The lawn gnomes and faded flamingos that Karen had so adamantly insisted he keep were first on his list. He wasn't one to care much for kitschy decorations, and he wanted his new home to reflect his own style, not that of the man who had lived there for decades before him. As he sipped his coffee on the porch, Chris noticed Karen standing across the street. She was wearing the same pastel athleisure wear from the day before, her clipboard tucked under her arm. She seemed to be surveying the neighborhood, her sharp eyes darting from house to house as if she were on some kind of patrol. Chris tried to ignore her, focusing instead on the peaceful chirping of birds and the soft rustle of the morning breeze. But it was hard to shake the feeling that she was watching him. He decided to start with the gnomes. Gathering them one by one, he placed them carefully in a box. Some were chipped and worn, their paint peeling from years of exposure to the elements. As he worked, Chris noticed Karen approaching. Her determined stride and pursed lips made it clear that she wasn't coming over to offer a friendly greeting. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded as she reached the edge of his yard. Her tone was sharp, and her voice carried the kind of authority one might expect from a drill sergeant. Chris set the gnome he was holding into the box and turned to face her. "Good morning, Karen," he said, keeping his tone light. "I'm just tidying up the yard a bit. These decorations are a little worn out." Karen's eyes narrowed. "Those decorations are part of the community aesthetic," she said. "You can't just remove them. It's against homeowner association guidelines." Chris took a deep breath, reminding himself to stay calm. "Actually," he said, "I looked into it last night. My property isn't part of the homeowner association. The previous owner opted out when the association was formed, and the exemption still stands." Karen's expression hardened. "That's ridiculous," she snapped. "Everyone in this neighborhood is part of the homeowner association. You can't just ignore the rules because you don't feel like following them." Chris crossed his arms, standing his ground. "It's not about ignoring the rules," he said. "Legally, this property isn't under the homeowner association's jurisdiction. I double-checked the paperwork." Karen's face flushed with anger. "This is unacceptable," she said, her voice rising. "If you start breaking the rules, it's going to ruin the neighborhood. I've worked hard to maintain the standards here, and I won't let some newcomer come in and undo all my efforts." Chris resisted the urge to roll his eyes. "Karen, I understand that you're passionate about the neighborhood," he said, "but I'm not breaking any laws. I just want to make my property feel like home." Karen stepped closer, her finger jabbing the air in his direction. "You don't get it, do you?" she said. "This isn't just about you, it's about the community. If you start making changes without approval, other people will think they can do the same. It's a slippery slope." Chris held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "Look, I'm not trying to cause trouble," he said. "I just want to take down some old decorations. That's all." Karen glared at him for a long moment before finally turning on her heel. "You'll regret this," she muttered as she marched back across the street. Chris watched her go, shaking his head. He couldn't believe how intense she was about something as trivial as lawn ornaments. He decided to press on, determined not to let her sour his day. By the time he had finished removing the gnomes and flamingos, the yard already looked much cleaner. Chris felt a sense of satisfaction as he stood back to admire his work. Later that afternoon, as he was trimming the overgrown hedges along the edge of his property, Chris noticed a piece of paper taped to his front door. Curious, he walked over and pulled it off. It was a formal-looking letter, printed on homeowner association letterhead. The text was bold and stern, warning him that he was in violation of community guidelines and would face fines if he did not comply. Chris felt his jaw tighten as he read the letter. He knew it had to be Karen's doing. There was no way the actual homeowner association had any authority over his property, and the letter didn't include any contact information or signatures from other board members. It was clearly an intimidation tactic. Deciding to address the issue directly, Chris called the phone number for the homeowner association that he had found during his research the night before. A friendly-sounding woman answered, introducing herself as Angela, the current president of the homeowner association. "Hi, Angela," Chris said. "My name is Chris, and I just moved into the neighborhood. I have a question about a letter I received from the homeowner association." Angela sounded surprised. "Oh, what letter?" Chris explained the situation, reading the letter aloud over the phone. When he finished, there was a moment of silence before Angela spoke again. "I'm sorry about that, Chris," she said. "But your property isn't part of the homeowner association. You're completely exempt from our guidelines. That letter didn't come from us." Chris felt a mix of relief and frustration. "I had a feeling it was Karen," he said. "She's been pretty aggressive about enforcing rules that don't apply to me." Angela sighed. "You're not the first person to have issues with Karen," she said. "She's very enthusiastic about the homeowner association. But she doesn't actually have any authority to enforce anything. I'll talk to her and make sure she understands." "Thanks, Angela," Chris said. "I appreciate it." After hanging up, Chris felt a sense of validation. He wasn't going to let Karen bully him into submission. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the last he'd hear from her. As he went about the rest of his day, he kept an eye out for her, half expecting her to show up with another demand or complaint. That evening, as the sun set and Chris relaxed on his porch with a cold drink, he noticed Karen peeking out from behind her curtains. She was watching him again, her face partially obscured by the blinds. Chris raised his glass in a mock toast, a small smile playing on his lips. He wasn't going to let her ruin his experience of his new home. If she wanted a battle, he was more than ready to stand his ground. Chris woke up the next morning feeling optimistic. The yard was starting to look the way he envisioned, and the clutter left by the previous owner was nearly gone. Despite Karen's confrontational behavior, he felt confident after his conversation with Angela, the homeowner association president. Knowing that Karen had no actual authority over him or his property brought a sense of peace. He decided to focus on finishing the landscaping work that day, hoping to put the incident behind him. As he stepped outside with a cup of coffee, the sight of a large, hand-lettered sign planted in his front yard made him stop dead in his tracks. The sign read "Violation of Homeowner Association Rules, Fines Pending" in bold red letters. Below it, in smaller print, was a list of alleged infractions: unauthorized removal of community decorations, improper lawn maintenance, and failure to comply with homeowner association landscaping standards. Chris felt his blood pressure rise as he walked over to inspect the sign. It was clearly homemade, but the audacity of it still stunned him. He had a good idea who was behind it. Sure enough, as he glanced across the street, he saw Karen standing on her porch, arms crossed and a smug smile plastered across her face. She didn't even try to hide the fact that she was watching him. Taking a deep breath to steady his nerves, Chris decided not to confront her directly. Instead, he pulled the sign out of the ground, carried it to his garage, and placed it next to the box of lawn gnomes. Karen's reaction was immediate. She stormed across the street, her clipboard in hand, and approached Chris as he returned to the yard. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, her voice sharp and accusing. "That sign is there to inform the neighborhood of your violations." Chris turned to face her, his expression calm but firm. "Karen, I've already explained to you that my property isn't part of the homeowner association. This sign is not only inaccurate but also trespassing. You had no right to put it on my lawn." Karen's face turned red, but she didn't back down. "You can't just opt out of the rules because it's convenient for you," she snapped. "This is a community, and we all have to follow the same standards. You're setting a terrible example for the other residents." Chris folded his arms. Karen, I'm not setting any example because I'm not part of your homeowner association. I've spoken to Angela, and she confirmed that my property is exempt. You have no authority here. Karen's eyes narrowed. Angela doesn't understand how things work around here, she said dismissively. I've been running this neighborhood for years. If you refuse to comply, I'll have no choice but to escalate this. Go ahead, Chris replied evenly. But I'd suggest you double-check your facts before you waste anyone's time. Karen huffed and turned on her heel, muttering something under her breath as she marched back to her house. Chris shook his head and went back to his landscaping. He hoped this would be the end of it, but he doubted Karen would give up so easily. Later that day, as Chris was unpacking boxes in his living room, he noticed a group of neighbors gathering in front of Karen's house. She seemed to be addressing them, her voice carrying across the street. Chris couldn't make out every word, but he caught phrases like property values and unruly newcomer. It was clear she was trying to rally them against him. Chris decided to take the high road. Instead of confronting the group, he walked over to a different neighbor's house, a friendly-looking couple he had seen walking their dog earlier. He introduced himself and struck up a conversation, casually mentioning his plans to improve his property and how excited he was to join the neighborhood. The couple, Sarah and Tom, were warm and welcoming, and they quickly reassured Chris that most of the residents weren't like Karen. She's been a thorn in everyone's side for years, Tom said with a chuckle. Don't take her too seriously. She likes to act like she runs the place, but she doesn't have as much power as she thinks. Chris felt a sense of relief. It was good to know that not everyone shared Karen's views. He thanked Sarah and Tom for their kindness and returned home feeling more connected to the neighborhood. The next morning, Chris discovered yet another sign on his lawn. This one read "No Trespassing Homeowner Association Property" and included a phone number for violations reporting. Furious, Chris took a picture of the sign and sent it to Angela, the homeowner association president, along with a brief explanation of the situation. Within minutes, Angela called him back. "I'm so sorry, Chris," she said. "Karen has no right to do this. I'll speak to her immediately." "Thanks, Angela," Chris said. "But I'm starting to think this isn't going to stop unless there are real consequences." "I completely understand," Angela replied. "I'll bring this up with the rest of the board. Karen's behavior is unacceptable, and we'll make sure she understands that." True to her word, Angela took action. That afternoon, Chris noticed Karen pacing in her driveway, her phone pressed to her ear. She seemed agitated, gesturing wildly as she spoke. Chris assumed she was talking to Angela or another member of the homeowner association board. By evening, Chris received an email from Angela confirming that the board had formally reprimanded Karen and warned her to cease her harassment. The email also included an apology from the homeowner association for any inconvenience caused by Karen's actions. While Chris appreciated the gesture, he couldn't shake the feeling that Karen wasn't finished. That night, as Chris sat on his porch enjoying the quiet, he noticed Karen's blinds twitching again. She was watching him, just as she had the night before. Chris decided to wave a small, cheeky gesture to let her know he wasn't intimidated. To his surprise, the blinds snapped shut immediately. Chris chuckled to himself. He wasn't sure what Karen's next move would be, but he was ready for whatever she had in store. The following morning, Chris woke up determined to go about his day without letting Karen's antics ruin his mood. Over the past few days, her constant interference had gone from mildly irritating to outright harassment, and while he had tried to remain calm and composed, he knew there had to be a limit to her behavior. However, he wasn't prepared for what awaited him when he stepped outside. There in his driveway was Karen's car. Parked at an angle, it blocked not only his vehicle but also part of the sidewalk. A small crowd of neighbors had gathered, their curious gazes shifting between the car and Chris's house. As Chris stepped out, he could see Karen standing nearby, clipboard in hand, as if she were orchestrating an elaborate homeowner association intervention. "Karen," Chris called out, keeping his tone measured but firm. "Why is your car blocking my driveway?" Karen didn't bother to turn around immediately. Instead, she finished scribbling something on her clipboard before looking up with an air of exaggerated innocence. "Oh, that? I had to park there while I was conducting an inspection," she said matter-of-factly, gesturing vaguely toward his property. Chris crossed his arms, his patience wearing thin. Inspection? Of what, exactly? Karen's eyes lit up with a self-satisfied smirk. Your landscaping, of course. There have been multiple complaints from the community about your non-compliance with homeowner association standards. Chris let out a slow breath, trying to contain his frustration. Karen, we've been through this. My property isn't part of the homeowner association. You have no authority to inspect anything here. Karen shrugged, completely unbothered. Rules are rules, Chris. Just because you think you're above them doesn't mean you are. By now, a few of the neighbors had inched closer, clearly intrigued by the exchange. Chris could feel their eyes on him, but instead of feeling pressured, he decided to use the moment to set the record straight. Actually, he said, his voice loud enough to carry, I've already spoken to the homeowner association board. My property is legally exempt, and Karen has no jurisdiction here. Any claims she's making are completely unfounded. Karen's smug expression faltered for a brief moment before she quickly recovered. That doesn't mean you can just disrupt the harmony of the neighborhood, she snapped. Your behavior sets a bad example for everyone else. Chris met her gaze evenly. The only disruption here is your behavior, Karen. And I'm going to have to ask you to move your car off my property, right now. Karen hesitated, clearly weighing her options. For a moment it seemed like she might comply, but then she crossed her arms defiantly. I don't think so. I'm not finished here. Chris pulled out his phone and began dialing. Okay then. I guess I'll have to call the police to report the trespassing. The word police sent a ripple through the small crowd of neighbors. Karen's face turned an alarming shade of red, and she quickly stepped forward. There's no need for that, she said, her voice rising. Let's not escalate things unnecessarily. Chris didn't lower his phone. Then move your car, now. With a dramatic huff, Karen stomped over to her vehicle, muttering under her breath as she climbed in. She backed out of the driveway with exaggerated slowness, glaring at Chris the entire time. Once she was gone, the neighbors began dispersing, some of them giving Chris sympathetic nods or murmuring words of support. Don't let her get to you, said Sarah, the friendly neighbor Chris had met the day before. She had been watching the scene unfold from her porch and now walked over to offer her 2 cents. Karen's been pulling stunts like this for years. Most of us just ignore her. Chris appreciated the reassurance, but he couldn't help feeling that ignoring Karen wasn't going to be enough. Her behavior was escalating, and it was becoming clear that she wasn't going to stop until she got her way or until someone stopped her. That afternoon, Chris decided to take action. He compiled all the evidence he had gathered over the past few days: photos of the signs Karen had placed on his property, a copy of the fake violation letter, and even a video of her blocking his driveway. He sent everything to Angela, the homeowner association president, along with a detailed account of the events. Angela responded quickly, apologizing once again for Karen's behavior and assuring Chris that the board would address the issue immediately. However, Chris wasn't content to leave things in the homeowner association's hands. He decided to consult a lawyer to explore his options. During his consultation, the lawyer confirmed that Chris had a strong case for harassment and trespassing. They advised him to send Karen a formal cease and desist letter, warning her that any further interference would result in legal action. Chris agreed, feeling a sense of relief that he was finally taking control of the situation. The letter was delivered the next day, and Chris made sure to be home when it arrived. From his living room window, he watched as Karen retrieved the envelope from her mailbox. Her expression shifted from confusion to anger as she read the letter, and she quickly marched across the street to confront him. Chris stepped outside to meet her, determined to remain calm. Karen was fuming, clutching the letter tightly in her hand. "What is this?" she demanded, waving the paper in his face. "You think you can threaten me with legal action? I'm just doing what's best for the neighborhood." Chris stood his ground. "Karen, this isn't about the neighborhood. It's about you crossing boundaries and harassing me. I've tried to handle this civilly, but you've left me no choice." Karen's face twisted with indignation. "Harassment? Don't be ridiculous. You're the one disrupting the community." Chris gestured to the letter. "That's not what the law says. If you continue to interfere with my property, I will take this to court." Karen glared at him for a long moment before storming off without another word. Chris watched her retreat, feeling a mix of satisfaction and exhaustion. He had stood up for himself, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Sure enough, later that evening, Chris noticed Karen holding what appeared to be a meeting on her porch. Several neighbors had gathered around her, listening intently as she spoke. Chris couldn't hear what she was saying, but he could guess the gist of it: more complaints about him and his disruption of the neighborhood. Instead of worrying, Chris decided to let Karen dig her own grave. He knew the homeowner association board was already aware of her antics, and he felt confident that any further attempts to rally the neighborhood against him would only backfire. As the night wore on, Chris finally allowed himself to relax. He sat on his porch with a cold drink, enjoying the quiet and reflecting on everything that had happened. Karen might have been a thorn in his side, but he wasn't going to let her ruin his experience of his new home. This was his property, his sanctuary, and he was determined to protect it, no matter what. Here's a detailed expansion of Chapter 5, wrapping up the story with a resolved and satisfying conclusion. Chris woke up the next morning with a sense of cautious optimism. The cease and desist letter had been delivered, and Karen's initial reaction, while predictably dramatic, seemed to have kept her from escalating further overnight. He hoped it would mark the end of her antics, but given her track record, he wasn't counting on it. By mid-morning, his hopes were dashed. A loud knocking at his door interrupted his coffee, and when he opened it, there stood Karen, her face a mask of outrage and defiance. Behind her was a man Chris didn't recognize, holding a notepad and dressed in business casual attire. He had the distinct look of someone caught in the middle of a dispute he didn't want to be a part of. "This is Mr. Daniels," Karen announced, her voice loud enough to carry to the neighbors. "He's from the Homeowner Association compliance team, and he's here to conduct an official inspection of your property." Chris looked at the man, who avoided eye contact and shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Daniels," Chris said evenly, "you should know that my property isn't part of the Homeowner Association. I've already spoken with Angela, your president, about this." Daniels looked up, clearly unsure of how to respond. Well, Karen insisted. Chris raised a hand, cutting him off gently. "I understand that Karen may have convinced you to come here, but you should also know that she's been warned by your board and by my lawyer to stop this behavior. I suggest you check with Angela before proceeding." Karen's face flushed an alarming shade of red. "You can't just dismiss us," she snapped. "This is about maintaining the standards of the neighborhood." Chris ignored her and turned to Daniels, who was already pulling out his phone. "Let me make a quick call," Daniels said, clearly eager to extricate himself from the situation. While Daniels stepped aside to make his call, Karen fumed silently, glaring daggers at Chris. He met her gaze calmly, refusing to rise to the bait. A few minutes later, Daniels returned, looking even more uncomfortable. "Mr. Chris," he said, "you're absolutely correct. Your property is exempt from the Homeowner Association, and this visit was unnecessary. I apologize for the inconvenience." Chris nodded. "Thank you for clarifying. I appreciate your professionalism." Daniels turned to Karen, who looked ready to explode. "Karen," he said firmly, "I need to report this to the board. This is a clear violation of our guidelines." Karen's mouth opened, then shut, as if she couldn't decide on a response. Without another word, she spun on her heel and marched back to her house, leaving Daniels to mutter another apology before hurrying away. Chris let out a long sigh of relief, but he knew the situation wasn't fully resolved. Karen had crossed a line, and while the cease and desist letter had made her cautious, she clearly wasn't ready to back down completely. That afternoon, Chris received an unexpected call from Angela, the Homeowner Association president. "Hi, Chris," she began. "I just got off the phone with Mr. Daniels. I want to personally apologize for what happened this morning. Karen's actions were completely out of line." "I appreciate that, Angela," Chris replied. "But this has gone beyond a simple misunderstanding. Karen's behavior is harassment, and it's starting to affect my ability to enjoy my home." Angela sighed. "I completely understand. We've already reprimanded her, but it's clear that isn't enough. The board is meeting tonight to discuss further action. I'll keep you updated." Chris thanked her and hung up, feeling a mix of frustration and hope. He was glad the Homeowner Association was taking the matter seriously, but he couldn't help but wonder if it would be enough to put an end to Karen's reign of terror. The following evening, Chris received another call from Angela. "Chris, I have good news," she said, her tone lighter than before. "The board has voted unanimously to remove Karen from her position as a homeowner association member. She's been barred from representing the homeowner association in any capacity." Chris felt a wave of relief. "That's great news, Angela. Thank you for handling this." "She's also been issued a formal warning," Angela continued. "If she continues to harass you or any other residents, we'll involve law enforcement." Chris thanked Angela again and hung up, finally feeling like the situation was under control. He couldn't resist a small smile as he imagined Karen's reaction to being stripped of her self-proclaimed authority. A few days later, as Chris was working on his front yard, Karen approached him. For the first time, she looked uncertain, almost sheepish. She hesitated at the edge of his property before speaking. "Chris," she began, her tone uncharacteristically subdued. I wanted to apologize." Chris raised an eyebrow, unsure of what to make of the sudden change in demeanor. "Apologize?" Karen nodded, wringing her hands. "I realize I've been overbearing. It's just that I've always cared so much about this neighborhood, and I didn't handle things the right way." Chris studied her carefully. While he doubted her apology was entirely sincere, he decided to take the high road. "I appreciate that, Karen," he said. "I'm happy to work with my neighbors to make this a great place to live, but I need my boundaries respected." Karen nodded, her eyes flickering briefly with something that looked like regret. "I'll stay out of your way from now on," she said before turning and walking back to her house. Over the next few weeks, the neighborhood settled into a new normal. Without Karen's interference, Chris was able to finish his landscaping and finally enjoy his home in peace. He noticed a change in the atmosphere. Neighbors seemed more relaxed, and several even went out of their way to introduce themselves and offer their support. One evening, as Chris sat on his porch watching the sunset, Sarah and Tom stopped by with a bottle of wine to celebrate the resolution of the ordeal. "Here's to standing your ground," Tom said with a grin, raising his glass. Chris smiled, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the kindness of his neighbors. Despite the rocky start, he realized he had found a community worth being a part of. And as for Karen, she kept her distance, her once dominant presence reduced to a quiet hum in the background. For the first time since moving in, Chris felt truly at home.